Most people think visualization is about closing your eyes and imagining something good happening to them. They think it's a mental exercise, a productivity hack, something you do for 5 minutes in the morning before the real work begins. And that's exactly why it doesn't work for them. What the research actually shows, and what a handful of people have understood for decades, is that the version of visualization most people practice is missing three specific mechanisms. Remove any one of them, and the practice collapses into wishful thinking. Keep all three, and something measurably different begins to happen inside the brain, inside the body, and eventually inside the life you're building. One man didn't just study those mechanisms, he used them to survive something that should have ended him, and then spent the next 30 years proving in laboratories why they work. His name is Joe Dispenza. In 1986, Joe Dispenza was 23 years old, training in triathlon, when a truck struck him during the cycling leg of a race in Palm Springs, California. The impact fractured 6 vertebrae. Two surgeons told him the recommended course of action was Harrington rod surgery, a procedure that would fuse portions of his spine together. Without it, they said, he would likely never walk again. With it, he might manage a partial recovery. He refused the surgery. What he did instead was spend approximately 2 hours every day in his hospital bed, constructing a detailed mental image of his spine rebuilding itself, vertebra by vertebra. He was not simply imagining healing in a vague, hopeful sense. He was designing a precise internal representation of biological reconstruction. If his mind wandered or the image lost clarity, he started over from the beginning. He gave himself that rule without exception. Within 9.5 weeks, Dispenza was walking. Within 12 weeks, he was back in training. For most people, that story ends there. A remarkable recovery filed under inspiration and forgotten by the next morning. But for Dispenza, it was the beginning of a question that would consume the next 3 decades of his life. What exactly happened in that hospital room? And can it be replicated deliberately? He went on to study neuroscience, epigenetics, and quantum physics. He built a research program that measured brain activity, heart coherence, and biological markers in thousands of participants across live events on multiple continents. He didn't theorize about visualization, he instrumented it. What Dispenza discovered wasn't that visualization works. It's that most people are doing 3 things wrong that make it functionally useless. You've probably tried it, maybe more than once. You set aside time in the morning or before sleep, and you picture what you want. The version of yourself that's calmer, sharper, more disciplined. The outcome you've been working toward. The life that feels like it belongs to you, but somehow hasn't arrived yet. And for a moment, something stirs. There's a flicker of possibility. Almost real. Almost within reach. Then the day begins. The clarity dissolves. The image fades like a dream you can't hold. And nothing changes. So you conclude, quietly and without much drama, that visualization is probably not for you. That it works for certain people, the naturally optimistic, the disciplined, the ones who seem to operate on a different frequency, but not for you. What you don't conclude, because no one told you, is that the practice itself wasn't wrong. The mechanism was incomplete. You were visualizing at your future instead of from it. And that difference, invisible on the surface, changes everything about what the brain does with the signal you're sending. The principle is visualization, but not in the form most people understand it. Visualization, as Dispenza defines it through years of documented research, is the deliberate construction of a sensory and emotional experience of a future state. In the present body, at the present moment, with enough biological precision that the brain begins to treat it as reality already lived. It is not imagination. It is not positive thinking. It is a neurological and physiological event. And it has 3 specific components that must be operating simultaneously for it to function as intended. The first component is sensory specificity. The brain does not respond to vague intentions. It responds to detailed multisensory input. Neuroscience research on mental rehearsal, including studies on motor imagery in elite athletes, demonstrates that when visualization is rich enough in detail, the brain activates the same neural circuits it would use during the actual physical experience. The more specific the image, the more indistinguishable it becomes from lived memory. The second component is emotional coherence. This is where most people's practice fails entirely. You can picture a desired outcome with high visual detail and feel nothing, or feel the anxiety of wanting something you don't yet have. Dispenza's research, which measured heart rate variability during meditation sessions, consistently showed that the body must generate the emotion of the experience before it exists externally. The feeling is not the reward for achieving the vision. The feeling is the signal that instructs the body to begin reorganizing toward it. The third component is identity continuity. The visualization must come from the perspective of a person who already inhabits the outcome, not a person hoping to reach it. The moment you picture your future self as someone fundamentally different from who you are now, the brain registers the gap as a threat and returns to familiar patterns. The image must be inhabited, not observed from a distance. These three components are not motivational concepts. They are measurable biological processes, and Dispenza documented all three in controlled settings. In the hospital in 1986, Dispenza did not visualize recovery as an abstract hope. He constructed a specific, detailed internal image of each vertebra, its structure, its position, its relationship to the ones above and below. He generated the physical sensation of movement, of health, of a spine that functioned. And he approached the practice not as a patient hoping to heal, but as a person whose body was already in the process of rebuilding. He applied the same three-component structure: specificity, emotional coherence, identity, in that hospital room before he had the vocabulary to name them. When the visualization broke down, he restarted it. When the image lost resolution, he rebuilt it from the beginning. The practice was not passive. It was an act of sustained, disciplined precision, repeated across weeks, without external confirmation that it was working. There was a point, documented in Dispenza's own account of the experience, somewhere around the third week, when the discipline nearly collapsed. The pain was still present. The medical consensus around him had not changed. The surgeon's recommendations stood. And the mental image he had been building, day after day, with deliberate precision, had produced no visible result he could point to or measure. He described the experience of sitting inside that practice and feeling for the first time that he might be doing nothing more than constructing an elaborate story inside a broken body. The doubt was not philosophical. It was physical and immediate. The kind that doesn't argue with you, but simply settles into the room and waits. What he did in that moment was not heroic in any conventional sense. He returned to the beginning of the image. He rebuilt it from the first vertebra. He held the rule he had given himself at the start. If the image breaks, start over. Not because he was certain it would work, because the alternative was to let the environment decide who he was going to be. That return, not to certainty, but to the practice, is where the principle revealed itself most clearly. Visualization, at its core, is not a technique for people who believe it will work. It is a discipline for people who refuse to let doubt set the terms. But this wasn't limited to one moment in Joe Dispenza's life. The same principle showed up again, in a completely different context. And the pattern it reveals is impossible to ignore. Decades after that hospital room, Dispenza began running what he called advanced workshops, multi-day immersive events that combined meditation, neuroscience instruction, and group coherence practice. These were not motivational retreats. They were instrumented research environments. Participants arrived with documented conditions: autoimmune disorders, chronic pain, anxiety disorders, metabolic dysfunction. They were measured before the event began. Brain scans, blood panels, heart rate variability readings. They were measured again after. What Dispenza and his research team were looking for was not anecdotal improvement. They were looking for measurable biological change produced by a deliberate shift in mental and emotional state. The results, published in peer-reviewed journals including Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, showed statistically significant changes in immune markers, gene expression, and brain coherence in participants who completed the full practice protocol. These were not outliers. They were consistent patterns across thousands of participants measured over multiple events on multiple continents. What Dispenza was demonstrating at scale was identical in structure to what he had applied alone in 1986. Sensory specificity, emotional coherence, identity continuity. The mechanism didn't change. The context changed entirely. In the hospital, the practice was survival. In the workshops, it was science. But the three components remained constant because they were never about the circumstances. They were about what the brain requires to treat a mental event as biologically real. This is the pattern that connects both moments. Dispenza never modified the principle to fit the context. He trusted the mechanism and changed the scale. Most people operate in reverse. They adjust the depth of their practice based on how serious the situation feels. They visualize intensely when they're desperate and casually when things are stable. Dispenza's two contexts, the hospital floor and the research stage, reveal that the principle doesn't respond to urgency. It responds to precision. The same three components, applied with the same discipline, whether the stakes are a broken spine or a biological marker in a lab report. That consistency is not a personality trait. It is a choice made repeatedly under completely different conditions, by someone who understood that the practice doesn't work because you believe in it. It works because you build it correctly, and then hold it without negotiation. Now that you understand what this principle is, how Joe Dispenza lived it, and why it showed up in every chapter of his life, the real question is what you do with it starting today. Most people visualize by telling themselves a story. I see myself succeeding. I see myself calm. I see myself there. That is narration. It is not visualization. The practice begins when you stop describing the image and start inhabiting it. Pick one specific future state, not a general life improvement, but one concrete moment. Where are you? What does the room feel like? What are you wearing? What do you hear? What does your body feel like from the inside? Spend the first 3 minutes of your practice doing nothing but building that sensory architecture until the image has enough resolution to feel visited rather than invented. This is the component most people skip entirely, because it feels dishonest to feel something you haven't earned yet. But the brain does not distinguish between a vividly constructed internal state and an externally produced one. Once the image has sensory resolution, ask yourself, what would I feel if this were already real? Not what would I think? What would I feel in the body? And then generate that feeling deliberately, before any external confirmation exists. Hold it for a minimum of 5 to 7 minutes. This is where the biological signal is transmitted, and it requires sustained effort, not passive imagining. Before you begin, make a single decision. You are not practicing this as someone who hopes to become a certain person. You are practicing as that person, inhabiting their posture, their level of calm, their relationship to the outcome you're building. This is not performance. It is an identity instruction you give your nervous system before the practice begins. If you enter the visualization as someone who is trying to get somewhere, your brain will spend the entire session registering the gap. If you enter it as someone who is already there, the brain begins organizing accordingly. The instruction happens before the first image forms. If you want to go deeper into everything we covered today, one book changed the way I understand visualization completely. Becoming Supernatural by Joe Dispenza. I'll leave the link in the description. The mind doesn't wait for the world to tell it who you are. It decides first, and then builds the evidence to match. The only question worth asking is whether you're the one making that decision, or whether you've left it to everything around you. Joe Dispenza, in a hospital room with 6 fractured vertebrae, made that decision before anyone around him believed it was possible. The practice is available. The mechanism is documented. What happens next is entirely determined by how precisely you choose to build it. And if this is the kind of content that makes you think differently, subscribe and hit the like button. It's the simplest way to help this channel grow and reach people who need to hear this. Which of these three components have you been missing in your own visualization practice? Sensory specificity, emotional coherence, or identity continuity? Drop it in the comments. Being honest about where the gap is where the practice actually begins. See you in the next one.